So let's take a look at some USMLE questions which came on insulin. The first one, in the presence of insulin, D-glucose transport across plasma membrane of adipocytes is much faster than L-glucose transport. Which of the following best describes the mechanism of glucose entry into these cells? Now, the question here is about adipocytes and it's about glucose transport. So when you talk about adipocytes, you must understand this is done by a transporter called GLUT4 transporter, GLUT4 transporter. Something special about this transport, which is not relevant to this question, is the use of insulin. So simple diffusion cannot occur because glucose is a polar molecule. It cannot pass through the cell membrane. Receptor mediated endocytosis. We haven't learned anything about glucose being taken up by the cell membrane like this. Next, carrier mediated transport, and this is exactly what happens here. Glucose is transported into the adipocytes by these GLUT4 molecules. Co-transport, it is in SGLT1 and 2, in which glucose and sodium enter into the cells, and primary active transport is about sodium potassium. Next, question 2. In a study of glucose transporters that facilitate glucose diffusion in various tissues, the following graph plots the number of glucose transporters found on the cell surface of two types of cells, A and B, against insulin concentration. Respectively, which cell types do the A and B most likely represent? So what is being asked here is, first of all, you need to understand the graph. Whenever you get a graph, always check the two axes, glucose transport expression versus insulin concentration. Now, when you talk about B, even though the insulin concentration increases, the glucose transport expression on the cell membrane remains the same. There's no increase in the glucose transporter expression. But when you talk about A, when insulin concentration increases, more and more glucose transporters get added to the membrane. That is what this line represents. And let's look at these. It asks respectively. So one has to be A. The first answer should be A. The second answer should be B. And in this case, adipocytes will work through GLUT4 transporters, which is the insulin dependent one. This is correct. Skeletal muscles also group a type of A type, so can't be the answer. Hepatocytes, group B. Cortical pyramidal cells, group B. Skeletal muscle cells, group A. Renal tubular cells, group B. Here is our answer. We had to search for this and we got it. Question is about a 24-year-old Caucasian male experiencing disorientation, palpitations, excess sweating, tremulousness, and all of which quickly reduced after drinking some honey dissolved in water. That is basically sugar in water. He has type 1 diabetes mellitus and his insulin has been stable for the last 6 months. Which of the following most likely precipitated this patient's symptoms? So what has happened here is his blood glucose levels have gone down. Blood glucose has gone down. So then there is exercise as the answer, which most likely corresponds to this. The next question, a study of cellular transport based on GLUT and SGLT is done on mice. A defect is introduced to the genetic mechanism of GLUT1 through GLUT5. So all these GLUT are knocked out. So the GLUT are not working. Which of the following cells has the ability to continue to take up glucose normally? Now remember, I told you guys, the GI tract and the kidneys, they are able to take up glucose via this SGLT2 and the SGLT1 transporters. So glucose and sodium will enter into the cells, and that is not adipocytes, it is enterocytes. Now this is not erythrocytes, not myocytes, and not pancreatic beta cells. All of these have GLUT receptors. So this is GLUT4, GLUT1, GLUT4 and GLUT2. And finally, the next question is about a 40-year-old man with a history of hyperlipidemia who comes for a checkup. His BMI is high and there are areas of hyperpigmentation in the folds of his neck. This is a condition called acanthosis nigricans, which is indicative of insulin resistance. And his fasting glucose levels are 120. So any value above 126 can be considered pre-diabetic or diabetic. His doctor prescribes moderate to high intensity exercise to prevent and treat type 2 diabetes mellitus. So how does that occur? It is definitely not this. This is what we want. No. Increased lipid metabolism. No. This is what happens. We need to move the glucose from blood into the cells. A 30-year-old woman comes to the clinic reporting a history of lethargy, fainting, and sudden irritability during the past few months. She notes that these symptoms improve after eating food with high sugar content. So that means she was in a hypoglycemic state and her vitals are normal. Her temperature, blood pressure, all of those are normal. On physical examination, she's sweating heavily and her extremities are clammy. And when you do a blood glucose test, it is very low. This patient's symptoms are mostly due to the activation of which of the following receptors? Remember, when tyrosine kinase receptors activate, it is going to cause insulin to work on. So this will cause the alpha subunit to be activated and that will cause glucose entry into the cells. So that means there is no blood glucose levels. That means that is why these blood glucose levels are low. Now let's take a look at the next question. That is question 7. A 34-year-old schizophrenic woman is brought to the ER due to dizziness, confusion and fatigue. She is not on medication for her schizophrenic symptoms and her husband, who has type 1 diabetes mellitus requiring daily insulin injections, reports that he has seen her using his insulin pens on several occasions and her blood glucose level is 50 milligrams per deciliter. That means she has taken insulin, which is explained here. So which of the following serum values is most likely in this patient? Now what happens here is there's going to be high insulin and low C-peptide because this is exogenous production. That is, in a pharmaceutical company, it produces insulin which will only have the beta and the alpha subunits of insulin. It will not include C-peptides. And this high insulin follows the same concept in this question. So now there's low blood glucose and that will lead to the symptoms which are shown here.